wish to extend my gratitude to the Institute, to the Center, and to His Highness for the invitation to be here with you today. My subject is the Middle East as a strategic crossroads. The world has come to a crossroads in modern history, if the world were to continue along the pathway currently chosen by my government and some others. Civilization will be plunged for as long as a generation or more into a global dark age comparable to that which struck Europe 7.5 centuries ago. We must not pretend that that danger does not exist. We must commit ourselves to the hopeful alternative which wise governments would prefer. Therefore, I should speak frankly but optimistically of a second crossroad, the Middle East. The history of oil in this region began with the British Navy's plans for what became known as the Great War, 1914-1918. That empire intended to use petroleum extracted from this region to provide its navy with a transition from coal-burning to oil-burning warships. Since that time, as all nations represented here know, this region has been dominated by the great powers' struggles over control of the special, strategically significant economic advantages of oil extracted from this region. But it was never oil alone which shaped the fate of the Middle East. For as far back in history as we know, as civilization reaches, long before the strategic crossroads of Eurasia of discovery oil, the Middle East has been the crossroads of Eurasia and Africa combined, as it is today, with or without petroleum. The historic strategic significance of the Middle East to itself and to the world will continue. Now there are some ill-conceived plans, including those which have been struck in discussions between my own government and that of Russia, to attempt to bypass present strategic dependency upon Middle East oil. Such a policy could only bring an added factor of chaos into an already explosive world monetary, financial, and economic situation as a whole. I would hope that I could persuade those powers to abandon such a recklessly incompetent economic and geopolitical influence. In any sane order of the world's strategic economic affairs, Middle East oil will continue to be an outstanding factor in the petroleum supplies of the world economy for at least a generation yet to come. This would be so for what should be implicitly obvious economic reasons. However, as in all matters of current world affairs, given the desperate situation of the world today, we cannot be so naive as to presume that powers which may be great, or even simply powerful, will react sanely to the relevant strategic facts of the situation. I focus on the subject of oil, but do that within the context of the historically determined strategic options for a Middle East which is defined in its ancient and continuing role as a crucial strategic crossroads of Asia, of Eurasia, and Africa. After defining that context, I shall return our attention to petroleum as such, situating the production and marketing of petroleum as a presently crucial factor of vital strategic importance for the Middle East as a region, with special ecological and implicit cultural qualities. I concentrate on three distinct interacting factors to be considered in the attempt to forecast the prospects of the region and also its petroleum. First, the ecological, second, the economic, and thirdly, the political strategic factors. To begin, zoom in as if from an orbiting space station upon the past and present ecology of this region of the world's biosphere. In our imagination, let us watch the long-range historical process of the melting of the Great Eurasian Glacier over the interval from about 19,000 years ago, when ocean levels were approximately 400 feet below the present those today. Watch the evolution of the Mediterranean region over the following millennia. Watch the later phase of the great desiccation of the once rich desert regions of Sahara, the Gulf, and Central Asia. From the standpoint of that elapsed time panorama, we are reminded in the most useful way of a fact we already know, that the most critical of the strategic economic factors inside the Middle East region as a whole is not petroleum, but fresh water. The characteristic of that portion of a predominantly Islamic civilization, westward from the Middle East and across Northern Africa, is a continuing struggle against aridization, which has continued during approximately the past 6,000 to 8,000 years. Today, we have the scientific potential to begin to control, if not entirely reverse, the effects of that post-glacial process. It is the principal strategic ecological challenge which obstructs the realization of an otherwise great potential. The potential which has existed for the greater part of 2 millennia in Arab civilization. It is to the degree that we make significant steps toward applying and improving the methods for production and distribution of fresh water, that other crucial factors of development can be brought into play. In that case, we shall see the implicit strategic potential of the Middle East as the crossroads of Eurasia. Any long-term forecast of the prospects of Middle East petroleum must be studied in the context of that challenge. The development of freshwater production and management, which is interlinked with the role of petroleum, is the indispensable foundation for all optimistic prospects for a peaceful and politically stable internal development of the Middle East as a region. If people lack the essential means to live, there is no peace. They will live as successive waves of land pirates did, including the Mongol Empire, as they swept into Europe and the Middle East from across Eurasia in times past under pressure of aridization. There will be no peace without adequate provision of water. This brings me to the pivotal economic issues. For this purpose, view the Middle East's greatest economic potential as a whole, as a pivotal economic strategic crossroads for Eurasia as a whole. While the Suez Canal's strategic importance of the link between the Mediterranean and Indian Ocean is obvious, I shall indicate why the cross-land routes across the Middle East are far more crucial forms of transport for Eurasia as a whole than for the Africa-Asia connections. It is a simple fact of accounting. The cost of transporting a product, as for example by sea, or by other means, must be compared with the cost of production of that product up to the point of embarkation. Therefore, we tend to transport products such as petroleums and grains, which have a relatively lower price per ton, by slower, cheaper water transport. The more useful work as value added to the product, as it moves through various phases of production, lessens the percentile of the cost of transporting the value represented by that product as a whole. Therefore, the more real value added by production to a raw or semi-finished material, the greater the relative prosperity from the export of the products, the greater it adds to the exporting nation or region of the nation. This has always been understood by the greatest economists and statesmen of the Americas and Europe since about 150 years ago. Until modern times, transport by water continued to be the principal roadway of progress in the material conditions of human life. This continued until approximately 170 years ago, when the German-American economist Friedrich List outlined what became the railway revolution. This development was accelerated by the successful development of the U.S. transcontinental railway system as a development of crucial importance for the U.S. emergence as a leading world economic power under our President Abraham Lincoln. After 1876, American methods, typified by the development of the American transcontinental railway system, were adopted in Germany, Russia, Japan, and elsewhere, including China. And admittedly, the attempt to connect the Atlantic to the Pacific eastward by rail, as the U.S. had connected the Atlantic to the Pacific westward, was seen by the British Empire as a threat to that empire's strategic maritime supremacy in the world as a whole, with two so-called geopolitical wars of the 20th century as a result. Admittedly, there is an influential utopian faction inside the U.S. today, which is prepared to unleash a geopolitical war throughout continental Eurasia for the purpose of preventing the internal development of the mainlands of Asia and Africa. These geopolitical policies are contrary to all rational definitions of the interests of the U.S. economy, which is itself now racked by an onrushing world monetary financial collapse. Unfortunately, those policies exist among presently very influential circles. Whatever U.S. policy might appear to be now, the reality of the present world economic crisis will probably force some sweeping changes in U.S. policy and thinking during the near future. There is no hope for the economic revival of the United States from the present world crisis without precisely such cooperation in the land transport-based development of the Eurasian and African continents as a whole. If the U.S. is to find a solution to the inevitable early collapse disasters caused by its present policies, this must include a special role for the Middle East. The approach to a solution to that strategic crisis does not lie in oil as such, but in the way petroleum production and marketing can be applied to serve the broader long-term interests of the region. Stable governments within the region and stable relations within areas outside the region are the first line of defense of the region from the forces and other perils which presently menace it. The crucial role of transport development is a leading example of the measures of defense required. The special advantage of modern rail or magnetic levitation, as compared with sea-based transport, lies in the elementary fact that with rare special exceptions, the product transported by sea does not improve in itself during transport. Under the right conditions, long-range transportation corridors, which are based on the central role of modern rail or magnetic levitation transport, are in net effect cheaper and faster routes of transport than the seas. As in the cases of the original U.S. transcontinental rail systems, these routes were not merely roads of transport. The transportation system transformed a virtual economic wasteland to a rich region of powerful economic development. In effect, every average kilometer or investment in the transportation system along these main and subsidiary routes gave back to the nation a net amount of produced wealth from agriculture, mining, and manufacturing far in excess of the cost of developing and maintaining the transportation system. Instead of thinking of connecting 2 points with a long-distance rail line or magnetic levitation system, think of the transport line as the central spine of a development corridor for up to 50 to 100 kilometers width. Running parallel to the spine are main line conduits of water and power. At appropriate places along the spine, agro-industrial residential complexes are built. Satellite areas of a similar type lie within the same corridor. What I have just described in a summary way is a modern equivalent of the methods which produced an agricultural industrial revolution in the United States approximately a century and a half ago. By concentrating resources of transportation, water, and power within development corridors, the most efficient use of these resources can be managed. The most economical use of the total available land area is achieved by tending to concentrate development in those corridors. Under conditions of continued growth, subsidiary development corridors will branch out from the principal ones. The same method can be applied with a combination of technologies either existing or within reach to transform the interior of Asia, including the deserts and tundras. Under proper policies, the physical net cost of such development corridors is less than zero. As goods flow along the spine of the corridor, new wealth is generated in and around each of the nodal agro-industrial residential locations along the route. Now look at the core of the Arab world, from the Atlantic to the borders of Iran, Turkey, and Transcaucasus. Center our focus upon the Suez Canal and Sinai, where Africa joins Asia. Focus on seaborne transport between the Mediterranean and Indian Ocean. See the crisscrossing of the region by relevant natural choices for routes of land-based development corridors intersecting seaports. Think of the volumes of raw materials and semi-finished goods flowing toward the Middle East by sea and by land, from Asia westward and from Europe eastward. The Middle East today is what has been in principle for thousands of years, even before the building of the Great Pyramid of Egypt. One of the great natural crossroads for the development of civilization. I emphasize once again that each time we combine materials and parts into semi-finished or finished products, we are decreasing the percentile of the total cost of that product incurred as a cost of transportation. The Middle East, once again, represents one of the world's most natural strategic locations for concentration of trade and production. It should not be a passive tool through which products are transported. It should become a crucial stage of strategic importance in the total process of the world's production of wealth. What happens to Middle East petroleum under these conditions? There will be a natural shift, a long-term shift, in patterns of consumption. Domestic consumption will increase with productive development. Also, there will be an increasing emphasis upon the use of oil and natural gas as chemical raw material feedstocks for production, especially Middle East production. What then can we forecast for the coming history of the Middle East oil? We must ask ourselves three key questions. First, what alternatives are available? Second, which alternative is likely to be chosen and by whom? Third, will the result be a success or a disaster like the 35-year succession of policy changes by which the United States and Europe have recently brought the world to the presently looming global economic financial catastrophe? If intelligent forces prevail, the world will contrast the failure of the 1971-2002 floating exchange rate monetary financial system with the relatively successful system dominant during the 1965 interval, the fixed exchange rate monetary financial system of that period. If these forces prevail, the most crucial features of the 1945-65 system will be copied in launching global emergency reforms. In that case, we shall soon establish a fixed rate, protectionist form of monetary financial system, a new gold reserve system similar to that of the 1945-1965 period. During a period of approximately 35 years, the USA and the UK and other formerly healthy industrial powers have been ruined by the utopian delusion of what has been called a post-industrial or consumer society. This utopian policy led to the wrecking of the then existing world financial monetary system. By the U.S. leadership in the 1971 breakup of the successful 1964-45 monetary financial system and the avalanche of destruction of the regulatory systems upon which the earlier stable economic development and prosperity had depended. Now that post-1971 system, monetary financial system, is hopelessly bankrupt. The delusion, let me interpolate, this system is now coming down. The date on which it will be finished is not certain, but it is coming down now. All talk of recovery to the contrary is based on loss. The delusion of the so-called new economy is collapsing into an inevitable bankruptcy. So about 35 years ago, the USA and UK made a change in world policy, which has now shown itself to be a change for the worse, terrible mistake. It is time to correct that mistake, to return to proven sound principles, and to cooperate and organize in the urgently needed global economic recovery. Under present conditions of general bankruptcy of the world's financial system, while a large-scale reorganization of bankrupt assets is underway, the crucial margin of economic recovery will be the creation of new, low-cost, long-term credit, which will be initially injected largely for long-term programs of development of basic economic infrastructure. This investment in infrastructure will then, as in the case of the Roosevelt reconstruction in the 1930s, will then cause the expansion of agricultural and industrial development. This investment must be supplied largely by perfectly sovereign nation states on the terms of simple interest between 1 and 2% for loans of up to a quarter century or longer. Under these conditions, there must be a greatly increased flow of high technology in terms of capital goods products to regions and localities of the world in which there's a critical lack of sufficient technological inputs. As a part of this pattern, we should require medium to long-term agreements on relatively fixed, fair prices for certain commodities, especially in world trade. This system of fair prices will include energy stocks, such as petroleum, which is very sensitive to the world circulation of credit. A fair price means a price at which the average supplier nation can continue to contribute profitably the volume and quality of product which the world economy requires. Stable prices of essential raw materials, such as petroleum, combined with nominal long-term rates of simple interest on primary flows of international credit, are a crucial necessity if a durable process of reconstruction is to exist. These measures must be adopted, not as a matter of taste, but as a matter of survival. Sometimes when a ship is sinking, no sane passenger says, "But I refuse to be seen on a life raft." It will be objected by some that we are living under conditions of spreading war, not conditions of peace under which the 1945 system was established. That warning is, of course, true. However, if nations are not willing to establish the institutional preconditions of durable peace, including essential economic preconditions, then the future of civilization everywhere would be a virtually hopeless one. It is better to mount the life. The first step is to recognize at once the simple fact the ship, the war-torn present world financial monetary system, is sinking hopelessly. Then, when that is recognized, perhaps the proper moves toward the peace and prosperity, life raft, will be the choice made by governments and others. Thank you. What happened on September 11th could not have happened without the connivance of something inside, very high level, inside the United States military command. However, you may recall that on September 10th, President George Bush was still committed to act for the establishment of the Palestinian state. What the effect of this attack was, particularly the fact that the planes could have hit Washington before New York. They were all in the air at the same time. So the decision was to hit New York first, when they could have killed the Vice President and the Secretary of Defense, who they missed. So they attacked New York because, you know, there's a famous case of a fertilizer-based bomb was put in the base of one of the Twin Towers in New York City. The purpose of hitting the Twin Towers was to inflame the American population against Osama bin Laden. If they'd hit Washington first, that would not have happened. But after they hit Washington, after hitting New York, Osama bin Laden was immediately blamed. As a matter of fact, I observed that when I was on a radio broadcast at the time the attack occurred. I said, I hope some idiot doesn't blame Osama bin Laden, who could never have done this. Even if he had the intention, could have done it. So that's number one. So there was an inside operation, and the inside operation was to produce the effect we've seen. The United States has gone into a kind of war which I oppose and warned against. It's a global war, it's a clash of civilizations war, in which the fact of the Sharon government in Israel is a very important detonator. The bombing of Iraq has helped to make the complications. The threat to bomb or attack Iraq makes it more complicated. We are at a point where I am concerned of the danger of a spreading Roman Empire-style clash of civilizations war very rapidly throughout Eurasia. So therefore, the people who did it, people who I suspect, I can't prove them, but I know what group did it, the group of Brzezinski and Huntington, that group intended to push the United States into this kind of policy and use an instrument of state terror to intimidate the United States government and people into following this kind of policy, which they otherwise would not have accepted. Osama bin Laden to me is of no significance. He has a certain significance when he worked for the United States and the British, but I don't think he's of any importance now. So let me be very frank and as delicate as possible on a certain aspect of this. This is not the most capable president of the United States we've ever had. He has known limitations. He is a victim of, therefore, of influences acting upon him. A president of the United States in particular, but it's also true in some other countries who've had a state. When you become the head of a nation, you must put aside all secondary political considerations. You are now responsible to the future population, the people of that nation, for the decisions you make. You must become the conscience of the nation, and the conscience of the nation must become your conscience. This poor fellow is not capable of doing that. Now, the basic problem operating here, and the previous question implicitly referred to that, to the question of me. Now, the problem here is not the Zionist lobby as such. Because the biggest factor in pushing the president into this support for Sharon is not Jews. There are Jewish gangsters involved. But the real force is the so-called Christian Zionists, fanatics. And they are the major force. They're the ones who are behind Sharon from an international standpoint. And there are other people who are exploiting that to push this president into something he would otherwise not do. If you know the history, if you look back in the history, you know how James Baker III behaved when he was Secretary of State in the question of Israel. And you can compare the way he has spoken more recently as a spokesman for this administration. These are not the same policies. The Bush family is not against Palestinians. It's not against Arabs. They're opportunists on the question, but they're not against them. They would like profitable arrangements, as many of you know. But in this case, they're pushed by political considerations, which are pushed by a powerful faction in the United States, which shares the ideas of people like Brzezinski, Huntington, and Kissinger. And this is where the threat comes from. And that's the reason for it. That my attempt to change this thing from inside the United States is based on those considerations. There are many people inside the United States, outside the Washington Delta, who are very unhappy with this and would like to have a change in the president's policy. But we will have to induce the president to change his policy. He's not the kind of man who's lucky to see his way clear on his own.
عزيزي تفضل تعرف صاحب الشيخ روسن تفضل.
There would be no rational reason for the United States to consider doing that. That doesn't mean it wouldn't happen. We have in Washington many things that happened recently, which no sane person would wish to do. And we have an out-of-control situation. Remember, I don't want to get into a long answer, but I think it's probably to answer the question in all fairly, this has to be taken into account. The United States, contrary to the leading press reports on CNN, International Lie Network, and similar mass media in the United States, contrary to these stories, the United States is already in a process of economic depression far worse than 1929, 1933. That is not something that might happen. That is already deeply happening. It's happening every day if you look at the details of what's happening in the U.S. economy and in Europe. It's going to get worse. Under these conditions, you have a government which is pretending there is no economic crisis. They are pumping billions of money, of Japanese money and other, into the system every day to try to conceal the fact there's a hopeless bankruptcy in progress. But if Japan yet goes, a few other things go, the housing bubble goes, the whole thing will then go flat. Under these conditions, the political institutions of the United States are at a point of insanity, especially the upper 20% or the upper 10% of the U.S. population, which is highly involved in these markets. They are about to see a bankruptcy like the world has not seen in centuries, far worse than the 1930s. They know it, and they're crazy. When you have madmen, people who are driven crazy by desperation, as the leading circles in the United States are right now, and the pressure on the U.S. government, under those conditions, anything is possible. You cannot predict. You cannot ask an astrologer what's going to happen next week. You have to know how can we intervene to try to prevent something awful from happening. That's what I'm involved with every day. When the United States admits that it's in a depression, we will then have a healthier situation, because the United States government will have to abandon every policy to which this government was elected. This presidency was elected. Every policy has to go. Every free trade policy, globalization. We have to go back to reforms like those of the Roosevelt period. And they're not willing to do it yet. If they say we're in a depression, the American people are going to say, let's go back to what Roosevelt did. Then you will have sanity. But until that point, we're in an extremely dangerous situation. And we have to fight in every country, on every day. We have to think about these things. And we have to try to intervene wherever we can to prevent the worst from happening.
There was a confrontation in the past between producer and consumer. Do you see any hope in the future that both sides can set and plan future of cooperation?
I see it up the hope. The hope is precisely this. We are in, as I said, we are in a collapse of the world financial monetary system, a collapse of the economy. We published in my magazine and others, we published the figures on this. It's clear. All the attempts to deny this are becoming undeniable. All right, under such conditions, how would the world recover? Now you're looking at, from your background, which obviously includes this knowledge, you're looking at a system which is no longer a sane financial system. We are now operating on the basis of financial derivatives which run into hundreds of trillions of dollars. We don't know how many there are because they're unregulated markets. These are obligations. We have bubbles, all kinds of financial bubbles. We see the collapse of the so-called telecom sector, which is collapsing. So we're into a major bankruptcy now. This means that we are at a point where we can save the economies through cooperations among national governments, but it requires state-to-state agreements of the type we made in terms of the first IMF agreement. If we went back to the model of 1945, 1965, and say, should we do this? Put the world through bankruptcy of reorganization. Do the things you do in bankruptcy, of what was so-called Chapter 11 in the United States. Get government credit mobilized to large infrastructure projects and so on. What do you do? Well, to maintain that system, we have to have a system of gold reserve-based system. Because we have to have a fixed currency value or a peg ratio, otherwise you cannot have cheap loans, 1 and 2% in international markets on long term. Under those conditions, the next thing you go to is certain categories of trade. Now this means that, as I've indicated, the price of petroleum should be a negotiated price between consumer and producer nations, among them, which should be fixed because we will now be fixing energy, which is the biggest key commodity in international markets. We fix that to the rate of currency. Now we can have an economy that will work, and we can invest. So therefore, we have to go to a fixed currency system, which includes precisely that kind of provision we used to think we had before 1971. We have to go back to that. And I would presume that under conditions of a crisis, when governments admit there's a crisis, then they will be willing to come together as governments and say, let's make a new system based on the best experience from the previous system. And under that condition, that would happen.
شكرا لمعالي الوزير لطرحه على السؤال وإجابة عزيزة تفضلي.
سيد لاروش لدي سؤالان. السؤال الأول يفيد بعض المحللين أن بريطانيا والولايات المتحدة تسعى لبناء إمبراطورية أنجلو ساكسونية، فما تعليقكم على ذلك؟ أما السؤال الثاني أفاد المفتش الدولي السابق في العراق سكوت رايتر أن بريطانيا والولايات المتحدة تخططان لسيناريو عودة المفتشين للعراق وذلك لتوجيه ضربة عسكرية له. فما تعليقكم على ذلك؟
Well, the Iraq question is a complicated question because the United States does not presently have the ability to attack Iraq. That is not as an effect in a war sense. The U.S. military estimates run between 200,000 to 500,000 troops to conduct a war against Iraq. This varies with how much they can rely upon Turkish troops or other troops in such an operation. The intention among the idiots, the insane idiots in Washington, like Bolsheviks and Galabi, that crowd is to go into Iraq as soon as possible, whatever, and to rely upon air power and similar kinds of methods that have failed in Afghanistan against Iraq. That is a possibility, because insane people will do insane things. If they have the authority, the president gives them permission, or doesn't deny them permission, they'll do it. However, you also know that from the State Department, from the Secretary of State, and from the military professionals in the Pentagon, the argument is, this is insane. Now, the reason why they oppose this is not because they have a desire for peace, but because being responsible military officials, they say it won't work. And therefore, they are falling for delay and other approaches for the time being, because they say an immediate attack on Iraq won't work. On the first question, there is a faction which has existed for a long time. It started by H.G. Wells and Bertrand Russell back in the 1920s and 1930s. It's a very powerful, very influential faction in international circles, especially English-speaking circles. This faction, which we call the Utopians, believed from the beginning that the existence of thermonuclear weapons, or nuclear weapons alone, would create weapons so terrible that nations would give up their sovereignty and submit to world government rather than face the prospect of having to fight wars with such weapons. This faction, which took over control of U.S. military policy once Eisenhower ended his term as president, this fact, which caused a great crisis around the world between 61 and 65, assassinations, coups at high levels, terrible things, this faction is the dominant faction in the United Kingdom and the United States today on military strategic policy. These people intend, especially since the collapse of the Soviet Union, to eliminate all nation states through measures such as globalization, and to establish a world rule of law on which appointed judges sitting someplace can sit in judgment on the citizen of any country without the consent of the country itself. Now this is a plan for a new Roman Empire under which legions of killers roam the world, shooting down people in order to control subject peoples. That is the intent of some people. In Britain, in particular the United Kingdom, you'll see in the London Guardian in particular, other voices saying this is insane, we shouldn't do it. But then you see the Blair government is fully in support of this policy by the United States. And British interests, British forces are working. The characteristic of this is kill. In former times, the United States and Europe, in modern times, we developed a sense of warfare. We did not believe in killing people. In warfare, you will kill people. But the intent of winning war is not by killing as many people as possible. In the Second World War, the United States won not by killing people. Some people had that idea, but as in the case of MacArthur, by using the superior logistical power of the United States to control the situation, you can bring about the conquest over an adversary without killing everybody. Because the object of war is peace. And if you're going to kill everybody, or nearly everybody, how are you going to get the survivors to accept loving peace? And therefore, the object of warfare is to win the war in order to win the peace. And therefore, this method, which is being proposed now, is not only bad because it's a military adventurous policy, but like the Roman legions, which ruled by killing people and terrifying people to submission, That's what's happening in Afghanistan. There is no way the United States can win a war in Afghanistan right now. It can't happen. It's mountain warfare. Mountain warfare against determined fighting forces, you cannot succeed. They will fade into the landscape and come out and shoot again. And this will go on as long as the United States is hated in particular. But these people have this kind of intention. They exist, they're a danger. My major concern has been for some time to try to expose this inside the United States and elsewhere, and to mobilize people inside the United States against this kind of policy. And I would hope that the world were more aware of this problem, and we could focus on that problem rather than trying to find some other problem to focus on.
الأستاذ فيصل القاسم من قناة الجزيرة تفضل.
سيد لاروش، أنا أعتقد أنك بلغت كثيرا في التركيز على دور هانتينغتون وبرجينسكي في الولايات المتحدة مثل هذا الرئيس.
Well, the popularity of the United States, popularity of the United States is largely controlled by the press reading the press. You had a famous story about the Pope. It's a real story. The Pope was asked on the anniversary of his birthday. He was asked, "How do you feel today? How's your health?" He said, "I don't know. I haven't read the press yet." So the president is not the most popular person in the United States. These are episodic people in the United States who are dominated by mass media. Will often report what's expected of them, as if in a dictatorship. I mean, you go into Germany and say, "Do you like Adolf Hitler?" And the German will say, "Yes, we like Adolf Hitler." They may have hated him. They may have made jokes about him. But the popular opinion says, in a powerful nation, you have to say what is expected of you. Huntington is well known in the United States. Very well known. Huntington is only one person of a group, which is organized at Harvard University under William Yandell Elliott. William Yandell Elliott created people out of mud, such as Henry Kissinger, Zbigniew Brzezinski. The first administration of Nixon's administration, both of them, for 8 years, were not run by Nixon, they were run by Henry Kissinger. That the second Carter administration was not run by President Carter. Carter was made president by appointment by Zbigniew Brzezinski, who was the associate, close associate and co-thinker of Huntington. The policies of the Middle East of Kissinger, Brzezinski, and Huntington were not made at Harvard. They were made by the British Arab Bureau in the personality of Bernard Lewis, who was the key designer both of the Alpha Crisis policy, which some of you may remember from back in the 1970s and 1980s, and this was the inventor of the Clash of Civilizations policy. So these policies this is the reality of the United States. The United States is run from the top down by people who are more and more divorced from the political parties. They vote for the parties, they don't participate in the parties, they're estranged. I hope to get them back into politics. But we're run by an elite. The elite is people like the Rand Corporation, the Olin Foundation, the Olin Institute, the Brookings Institution. These institutions and money from Wall Street controls the leadership of the parties and controls public opinion, controls the mass media of the United States. So the politics is often done behind the scenes, and what the people get is what's put on the surface. But Huntington, you're misinformed. Huntington is one of the most, Huntington wrote a book at Harvard in 1956. He wrote it under Elliott. He wrote it together at the same time. He was in the same group with Kissinger. It's called The Soldier of the State. The utopian military policy of the United States is based on that book. That book has been regularly reprinted again and again to the present state. This is the book, which is the basic manual for all utopian military thinking inside and outside the military in the United States today. So when you're talking about Huntington, you're talking about the man who wrote the book, who has the greatest influence for the bad on the military thinking of the military cadres in the United States today. So this is no obscure fellow. The president, Bush, is extremely obscure compared to Huntington in the thinking. This sort of thing goes on. You have people like Lantos and others in the Congress who are notorious. You have the members of the Congress such as DeLay from Texas, others of that type, who are Christian Zionist fanatics. That doesn't mean they're Christians. They're Christian Zionists like Pat Robertson or Jerry Falwell. These people are more Israeli than the Israelis. What they believe is this, and they're also, partly they're bought by money. And they're bought by big money, by so-called Zionist money, the mega crowd in New York. But the other side is they actually believe, or their base believes, that if they can bring on a battle of Armageddon and cause a general Middle East war of the nations, that God will intervene and they won't have to pay the rent next month. This is what they believe. If you look at the television sets in the United States and see the international broadcast of these lunatics, you're dealing with the most dangerous lunatics on this planet right now. There are no other lunatics on this planet who can cause greater damage to the world as a whole than these kinds of lunatics inside the United States. And they have voices in the Congress, important voices in the Congress. They're lunatics, but they're congressmen. And they do say these kinds of things. They come up all the time. This does not necessarily mean the threat is real. These people are also, they're frauds. They often say things to be heard saying them, not because they actually expect to get the result.
Last question, صحيفة البيان تفضل. آخر سؤال. أرجو الاختصار.
سؤال مستر لروش، قد دعوت إلى ضرورة التعاون بين الولايات المتحدة ودول الشرق الأوسط المنتجة للنفط، واقترحت عدة حلول ناجحة على الورق، ولكنها عند التطبيق كيف يمكن أن يتحقق التعاون بين أوروبا وأفريقيا والشرق الأوسط والولايات المتحدة في ظل عدم وضوح السياسة الأمريكية من خلال الحكومات التي تعاقبت عليها الفترة الأخيرة، والكيد بمكيالين لحل المشكلات الدولية وعلى رأسها مشكلة القضية الفلسطينية وبؤر الصراع الممتد حاليا في قارة آسيا. كيف يمكن؟
The problem is this. In Europe, from inside Europe, the majority of the Western Europeans would be fully in support, totally in opposition to what Israel is doing, totally in opposition to U.S. policy toward the Middle East at present. But the Europeans have no courage. Maybe a few here and there do. A few speak up. But when the United States speaks, the United Kingdom, and especially continental Europe, says, yes, Father, we hear. Now, but the point is the vital interest, we take Western Europe and the Middle East. The vital interest of the Middle East is not only, the vital interest of Europe is not only in the Middle East as such. I spoke of the Middle East as the crossroads of Eurasia and Africa. If you have the kind of chaos in the Islamic world which these terrible characters are trying to unleash, where can you find peace in Eurasia? In order to have peace and economic development in Eurasia, you must have China, India, and Pakistan and Russia not fighting. Then you can have other nations and bring them together for cooperation. But as long as you have these hot issues, you can't have peace. If you have a fight against Islam, which is what this thing is, it's a crusade against Islam, and that's what we're talking about. Then Europe has no chance, because Europe cannot revive from the economic crisis except through markets in Asia, chiefly Asia, the Middle East, which includes Turkey, which includes Transcaucasus, which includes Iran. This is the market. If this area is destabilized, Europe has no choice, no chance. Therefore, Europe's vital interest is to have Middle East peace. And every European leader we talk to, whether it's in Italy, in Germany, or the same ones in France, all agree that Middle East peace is a desperate strategic imperative for Europe, economically and otherwise. Otherwise, no Africa, no Asia. So, but the Americans say, no, we run the world. And the British support us. Blair supports us at least, while other British are very critical of this, for one reason or another. So we're at a point, what's going to happen? Why am I so optimistic? Because the whole shebang, the financial monetary system is coming down. Under those conditions, the United States does not have the power to do the things it says it intends to do. The United States decided to become a Roman Empire at the end of its power, whereas the Roman Empire was begun at the beginning of its power, at the height of its power. The system is collapsing. Yes, the United States is still a potentially powerful nation, but not with this sick economy. To get out of this mess, it must come to agreement with other nations, especially with Europe and Japan, especially with Asian countries. And then we could get out of this mess. If I were president of the United States, we could get out of this mess tomorrow. Because if the president of the United States calls other nations together and says, meet with me tomorrow morning, we've got an economic crisis, so we've got to come to an emergency agreement. The nations would come. They would scream and protest, and they'd come. And they'd agree. And you'd have a new system. Not a perfect system, but a system which would enable us to stabilize the world situation. Under those conditions, at that point, Europe, which is now almost a useless voice in terms of this issue, would suddenly become a very important voice, because Europe would then be in a position to assert its interest. Not to say our interest is not to be bombed by the United States, which is what they think now.
اسمح الوزير السؤال الأخير من صحيفة الاتحاد. لا قال وقت مع الوزير.
سيد لاروش، طبعا لم نرى لم أرى نفسي أنا في حياتي مثل هذا الطرح الذي طرحته بخصوص هذه الصراحة. لم أرى نفسي أنا في حياتي مثل هذا الطرح الذي طرحته بخصوص هذه الصراحة بالنسبة للسياسة الأمريكية، سواء كان حتى في المذكرات اللي احنا قرأناها لجيمس بيكر أو المذكرات اللي حتى شفناها لكيسنجر. ولكن لي ملاحظة، هل السيد لاروش حينما نقرأ السيناريو في 2004 وحينما يعتري عرش الولايات المتحدة الأمريكية، هل لسان حاله هيكون بمثل هذا النقد وبهذا الأسلوب في عملية التغيير في السياسة الأمريكية، خصوصا وأننا نعلم أن السياسة الأمريكية هي منظمة من أيام جورج واشنطن، ورؤساء أمريكا ما هم إلا عبارة عن أشخاص بيؤدوا سيناريوهات لسياسة مسبقة ومستقبلية لأنماط معينة في اتجاه مدى العالم. هل هذا الوضع سيكون لنا نظرة في عملية الرئاسة الأمريكية 2004 أنها تكون ملائكية على مستوى العالم بخلاف الصورة التي نراها الآن؟
I was the person who designed what became known as the Strategic Defense Initiative, which was announced by President Reagan in 1983. I've been involved with my government in dealing with it, dealing with institutions and many related questions at that time over a period of time. I've been involved with various nations, such as my defense of Mexico, my defense of Argentina, and other countries many times. So I have a track record on this, and I've also never given in to pressure on what I knew to be a question of faith. It is one of the reasons I have so many problems, because people know that if I say it, I mean it. If I say I'm going to do it, it will happen. Because, see, the secret of wisdom, and some of you know this from a theological standpoint as well. The problem we have in society, if you are a leader, what's the great moral problem of leadership? The problem is that the people are so concerned with immediate small things in their neighborhood, in their immediate pain in their belly, and things of that sort, which are legitimate concerns. But they don't think of what happens after they die. They don't think that they're born and they're going to die, that we are all going to die. If we are all going to die, then what's our interest? What is our interest as a total person if we know we will all die? It is what we do with our life. It's what's said in the New Testament about the parable of the talents. You are given a talent. It's a life. What are you going to do with it? What you do with that life is what you are for the rest of eternity. The people who are effective leaders of nations have that kind of love for their people and for the people of the world of that kind. because they have a mission. It's given to them. This ability to have this thing, this commitment to immortality, is something that's given to you. Life is loaned to you from birth to death. And what you do with that life becomes what you are. That's your interest. Are you giving justice? Are you acting for the future of mankind? Do you have the eyes of the past dead upon you? Do you have honor in the eyes of those who died and went before you? So you never elect a leader as a leader and trust him as leader unless they have that kind of moral commitment. We would hope, and I would hope that sometime in the future, we would not need to find that such leaders were exceptions in their people. In the meantime, we count on such leaders to guide, or people who can approximate that, to lead us and lead the people through the swamps of danger.